Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Cochran from Brandon M. Cochran and Associates. We are a family educational advocacy practice. We help support families as they navigate the educational environment, all the way from general education to 504s, 504 plans, and then special education and IEPs. This presentation is really geared for families that already have a child that has an IEP. It's titled, My Child Has an IEP, Now What? So we're going to get into the different parts of an IEP, different questions you should be asking, the lens you should be looking through, and then even some of those more specific questions. How do I talk about outplacement? How do I talk about getting a one-on-one aid? Those are just a few examples. Before we get into this presentation, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. My lovely family is pictured here, my wife, my son, and my daughter. I was a teacher for 10 years. I taught in the general education setting and the special education setting. I had a self-contained classroom where my students had multiple disabilities, including significant cognitive impairments. So they were actually in the 8th grade, but they were performing more at the kindergarten level. I have 2 master's degrees, one in administration and one in special education. I became the director of special education for a smaller district of 1,500 students. About 150 students had IEPs. And then I became the director of special education for a much larger district, and eventually the executive director of student services for that same district. With 14,000 students, approximately 1,800 students had IEPs. My son has a 504 plan, so I am in that world regularly, meeting with his school district annually, revising his plan, making sure his medical safety plan is also up to date. But a little bit more about my specific story. I had an IEP when I was in elementary school. And it's a little difficult to share about that. And I'm not really sure why, but it just kind of is for me. But in 2nd grade, I started to really struggle. I had a great teacher that noticed this and recommended me for an evaluation. At the time, obviously, as a 2nd grader, I had no idea what was going on other than I was taking a bunch of tests. But I was evaluated and found eligible for needing special education support. And I just remember in school feeling extremely overwhelmed with learning with my entire day. And I thought that was normal. I thought all my friends felt that way. I had no idea how much I was actually struggling. At the time, I was diagnosed, I would assume, with a specified learning disability, so SLD, specific learning disability. And they didn't have the push-in model or the co-teaching model that they do now. So I was pulled out of the classroom for math and reading, and then almost like an independent work time. So I had almost like a study hall built into my day where I learned to be independent with my learning and my homework. And just getting things done, executive functioning skills, remaining organized, things like that. And through my elementary experience, I was one of 3 kids in the grade that had to go to this classroom every day. And there was a stigma associated with that. I didn't really like, being the kid that had to be pulled out and needed special help. So I worked very, very hard. When I got to middle school, it was called junior high at the time, I decided I no longer wanted this IEP. And I decided to work really hard, and I was already working very hard. I do believe I had a great team of teachers that helped close the academic gap or the achievement gap, whichever term you want to use there, to help bring me back up to grade level. And in 8th grade, the special education team sat down and had a conversation with me present and my parents and said, we're not really offering Brandon any more special education support. We don't think he needs these services anymore. And that was also another very good day in my life. I moved on to high school and did not need any supports. I went on to college. I did not need any supports. And then obviously I have 2 master's degrees now. So not only is my son involved in additional support in terms of a 504, but I also lived it. And I know what it feels like for students, for families to go through this. And my job here is to really help guide people and get answers to them so they can make the most informed decisions for their own children. I like to take a minute and just talk about this little plaque that I have. I keep it on my desk, and it says, "Take note when you're feeling overwhelmed. Think about why you started." And then I had to write in the little star there, "to make a difference." And this was proposed to me as a teacher at a professional development that we were doing within the school. And it challenged us to remember why we started doing what we're doing. And everything that I've done, from being a teacher in the general education setting to being a teacher in the special education setting, to moving on to administration at the district level as a director and then as an executive director, and even now helping to provide guidance to families as an educational advocate and consultant. My goal here is to make a difference for the students that I taught, for the students that I helped lead teachers while they were teaching, and for your children. So there's just a little more about me, and my philosophy moving forward is to help make a difference in kids' lives. This slide talks about equity versus equality. And I think this slide does a fantastic job and even takes it a step further in terms of closing the achievement gap. So the first picture on the left, we have all students getting the same level of supports. And as you can see, not all of the students in that picture can experience watching the baseball game in the same way. In fact, the child on the right in that first picture can't see it at all. The second picture moves on to really differentiate different levels of support so that all students can see the baseball game in the same way. This is what special education, 504 plans, and MTSS tiered systems of support are designed to do, is essentially level the playing field so that all students have equal access to education. The picture on the far right takes it a step further, and I know previously I mentioned that my own personal education team was able to close the achievement gap, and I think that's what this picture illustrates the most, is there are no supports needed any longer. All students can participate and watch the baseball game or participate in learning without any supports needed at all. Now, keep in mind, each situation is completely different. Each child is completely different. For example, the students that I taught in my self-contained classroom will most likely need special education support throughout their entire educational career. So this final picture of closing the achievement gap doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but it's important to keep in mind that special education is not a destination. It should be seen as a level of support, give extreme intervention, and then hopefully, if possible, allow the child to exit those supports so they can participate in a mainstream or a general education environment. What is an IEP? Most of us already know that an IEP stands for an individual education plan. And we emphasize individual because it is designed to help your particular child based on their own particular set of needs. It is different for everybody. I like to use this as a rule of thumb. Pretend that you're moving. And if you can't hand that document over to the new school and have them read it without any additional background knowledge on your child and implement it seamlessly, then that IEP is not written adequately. If you read it a week later or a month after your meeting and there are parts that don't make sense to you, or there are parts that you still have questions on, it is not written adequately enough. That needs to be detailed enough so that you can take that legal document, it is a legal document, to the new school and they can implement it seamlessly. Now, there's typically an intake meeting that would happen if you actually were to move and they want to have a conversation to get to know you and get to know your child more. And that's completely understandable and within the realm of realistic. But a good lens is to pretend like you're moving. And can you take that document to the new school and have it implemented seamlessly? Another thing to keep in mind is the entire special education process is a legal process. It starts with a domains meeting. If you have an IEP, you went through that already. The district will talk to you about the different areas of concerns. Some examples are cognitive, academics, social emotional, motor ability, how your child moves in the classroom or throughout the school. Those are just a few examples of the domains. Then the school district has you sign off on getting an evaluation. The district is not allowed to evaluate your child aside from other children without your permission. If they do the evaluation to all children in the classroom or in the school, then they can do it without your permission. But because we're talking about an individualized education plan and special education supports, they're doing these evaluations to only your child. It requires your permission. After the evaluation period is over, which, keep in mind, takes 60 school days. The school district has 60 school days to evaluate a child. Keep 60 school days in mind, right? We're talking about there's winter break, which is 2 weeks. There's Thanksgiving break, which is typically 1 week. We've got days off like President's Day, Martin Luther King Jr. All of those days, spring break, they don't count in those 60 days. So 60 days can look more like 75 days real quick. And that can, if you time it right at that time of year, it can take half of a school year. After the 60 days is up, you come back to the table for an eligibility meeting. At an eligibility meeting, the school district will talk through all of the data they collected during that evaluation, and they will have a conversation with you on if your child qualifies for special education support. If your child does qualify for special education support, you will move into an IEP meeting, where an IEP, an individualized education plan, will be developed for your child. You have a voice at all of these meetings. So it's important, if you don't understand something, if you have questions about something, to ask, and ask them in that meeting, because they are required to document any additional conversation, which means they'll write it down and it's captured in the IEP. That memorializes that conversation so that if anyone forgets that that conversation happened, you can go back and it's found in the physical records. After your child has an IEP, you will have an annual review. Every single year, the district is required to revisit the IEP and go through it with you again and document any changes that might need to be made. Every 3 years, your child has to have a re-evaluation. So every 3 years, they will go through and they will have another domains meeting. They will have another evaluation, which takes 60 days. They will have another eligibility meeting, and they will create a new IEP based off of that data that they collect. This slide reviews some of the information we just covered. The IEP special education process starts with a domains meeting, which requires your permission to evaluate your child. They'll talk about the different areas of concerns. This is your opportunity to also voice your concerns in any of the areas they bring up. Remember, some of those include academics, cognitive, social, emotional, motor, health, so like vision and hearing. The school district then has 60 days to complete their evaluation. I know I talked about it a lot on the last slide, but remember, breaks and weekends do not count in those 60 days. After the evaluation is complete, the district will let you know of a date and time for an eligibility meeting, and they will discuss if your child qualifies for special education support under the 13 areas of eligibility. And those areas of eligibility are defined by the Illinois State Board of Education. So it is the same for all students in Illinois. Illinois State Board of Education is guided by the federal government and their laws. This illustration provides kind of a wraparound of how this IEP process is supposed to work. So it starts with a referral for an evaluation. A referral can be made by anybody. It can be made by you as the parent. It can be made by a school member seeing your child struggle. Then there's an evaluation. Then there's an eligibility meeting. Then the IEP is developed. The IEP, while it's being implemented, is monitored with data to make sure that it is working and that your child is improving on the goals that the school district has set forth and you've agreed upon. It's important to recognize that students should be growing. All students can learn. If, for whatever reason, the child is not learning, there needs to be an adjustment to the interventions that are being used, to the IEP, to the goals, to what type of stuff is being done in the classroom. All of that needs to be looked at and modified accordingly based on student growth. And then the IEP is reviewed annually. It's important to recognize you have the right to call an IEP meeting at any time for any reason. I encourage people to call IEP meetings when they have larger questions, because those questions and those answers will be documented in the IEP paperwork. This slide gets into how does an IEP work. It's a legal document that has structures in place and build upon each other to work through the entire system and the entire process. So the first thing that we look at within an IEP is that data drives the ship. Within school districts, they should be making data-driven decisions based on your students' individual data. We're talking about assessment data. We're talking about classroom data, behavioral data. All information is considered data. We need to make decisions based off of that. So we start with data. It comes from an evaluation. Let's just say we're starting the process from the very beginning, right? We have the domains meeting. The domains lead to permission from you to hold an evaluation. Within the evaluation, you get data. You come back to the table for the eligibility meeting. At the eligibility meeting, you talk about what the data means and if your child qualifies for special education. We're saying at this point that your child does qualify for special education. So from that data, we're identifying an adverse effect. Somehow, somewhere, your child has a deficit. The data describes what those adverse effects are. Within the IEP, there is a spot for where they should write, the district should write, adverse effect. And that adverse effect statement should detail out the deficits your child has. And that's really important because sometimes I see adverse effects are written for specified learning disability or SLD, specific learning disability, and they don't address at all the fact that your child also has ADHD. So there is no OHI or other health impairment eligibility. In my opinion, they're not fully capturing what your child's deficits are. From the adverse effects, there's an educational need developed. What type of educational need is there that needs to happen to close the achievement gap? After the educational need, there should be present levels. And that's a report that either the psychologist will write or different members of the team will write, the educational team. And that also, all those present levels will outline the deficits and the needs that your child has. From the present levels, there should be goals that are written. The goals are based on the present levels where there's a deficit identified. After goals, there's also a spot for accommodations. Accommodations are different things that can be put in place within the classroom or the school environment to help level the playing field. Some examples of these might be extended time on taking tests, preferential seating in the classroom to limit distractions. There's a number of other accommodations that can be done, but those are just some examples. Then the IEP moves on to the services and minutes. It should detail how many minutes are in a typical school day. And then it breaks down where your child spends those minutes. Is it in general education? Which classes are in general education? Which classes are in special education? Where is your child receiving some of those additional supports, if they qualify for them, such as social work minutes, OT, occupational therapy, or PT, physical therapy minutes? During every IEP meeting, every annual review meeting, ESY, which is extended school year, and transportation need to be discussed. Extended school year is essentially school over the summer, but it's not summer school. Extended school year is something children with IEPs need to qualify for. A good rule of thumb for qualifying for ESY services is how much regression does your child experience over breaks? Does it take a week or two to catch them back up after winter break? If it does take a week or two, is that consistent with Gen Ed same age peers? If it's the same, then there's not really a need for ESY. But if the regression takes a month to remediate and bring your child back up to speed, and it takes everyone else a week or two, then there's a good chance your child could qualify for extended school year services. So that's how to frame that conversation with the school district. And then all of these things, data, adverse effects, educational need, present levels, goals, accommodations, services and minutes, ESY and transportation, they result in placement. So you talk about everything your child needs first to be successful and to close the achievement gap. And the last thing you talk about is placement. And that's by design. And I know typically in these meetings, placement is the first thing that as parents we want to talk about. I want to know where my kid's going and where he's going to get these services. But if you follow this outline and this plan, at the end, it's very difficult to argue where the appropriate placement is, because the entire team just outlined exactly what your child needs. At the end of that conversation, they have specific places that can meet your child's need. So if we're talking about general education with a co-taught teacher, great. Maybe we're talking about a self-contained classroom that focuses on the skills and the goals that your child has. That placement is kind of spotlighted and shined a light on in terms of this is where they should be to receive the proper placement. Or we're talking about potentially outplacement. Some families really like to talk about that. Some families don't. But it's guided by the data that is outlined in all of these different steps first. And then it's up to the conversation between you and the school district as to where's the most appropriate place for your child. School districts are required by law to provide your child with the least restrictive learning environment to receive a free and appropriate public education. Those are two special ed laws that are very commonly used. So they cannot take a child that would benefit from being in a co-taught gen ed classroom, and they cannot put that child in a self-contained classroom, because that is not the least restrictive environment for that child to benefit from, to learn, and to close the achievement gap. Likewise, if your child actually needs a self-contained classroom, they can't keep them in a co-taught gen ed classroom, because it's not the least restrictive environment to receive a free and appropriate public education where the child is making meaningful gains. And these are very deep ideas and conversations, but this is how school districts have these conversations. And this is the important information you need to be equipped to go in there and have these conversations and understand what the district is talking about. In these next few slides, we're going to look at some goals. and what a good goal looks like. Also, what should be presented to you in terms of information or present levels that help determine if a goal is appropriate. So we'll start with the goal first. A good special education IEP goal should be a SMART goal, and that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely or time-bound. On the right side are some examples of goals that we'll kind of walk through to evaluate if they're actually SMART goals or not. So the first one is Penelope will be able to solve 2-digit addition problems. Okay, is it specific? It is fairly specific in terms of solving 2-digit addition problems. Is it measurable? I would say no. How many problems is Penelope going to be able to complete, right? Is it achievable? We don't know if it's achievable. I don't know if Penelope can currently solve 1-digit addition problems based on the information given. Is it relevant or realistic? Once again, we don't really know that. This is where the present levels come in. And is it timely? Is it time-bound? No, it's not. There is nothing mentioned as to when Penelope will achieve this. Okay, then we'll move on to the next bullet point, which gets a little better. With 2 teacher prompts, Penelope will be able to solve 2-digit addition problems. When I said it gets better, it just gets a little more detailed, right? I still see issues with it not being a SMART goal. But the other problem I see with this is now we're talking about with 2 teacher prompts. I always want students to be independent. And that's what we're working towards. Students being independent to successfully solve, in this case, 2-digit addition problems. Maybe 2 teacher prompts is relevant. If Penelope can do this and she needs 10 teacher prompts, then having 2 teacher prompts might be a good goal. We're still working her towards independence, but it's still not timely. We don't know if it's achievable. It's not measurable. Now the last one is Penelope will be able to solve 2-digit addition problems with 75% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher charted data, and standardized tests by February of 2023. That February of 2023 is taken up by my little video there, but it is there. So now we go through, is it specific? It is very specific. We're looking at specific 2-digit addition problems. Is it measurable? Yes, we have 75% accuracy. If it's below that, Penelope is not meeting this goal. Is it achievable? We still don't really know that because we don't know where Penelope is currently starting. And in an IEP, there's present levels with every goal. And we're going to get into that in the next slide. But that's where that achievable part comes in. Is it relevant? Hopefully Penelope is moving on from 1-digit addition problems to 2-digit, so we'll say it's relevant. And is it timely? Yes, it is timely because we're saying by February of 2023. So this is what a decent looking SMART goal would be. We're moving on with what a good goal looks like. It must include present levels. At the beginning of an IEP, you should be given a present levels report. And that includes kind of an overall of how your child is doing. And then with each goal, there should be a section right above the goal that says present levels. And there should be a write-up of how your child is currently doing as it relates to this goal. And we'll look at this example right now. The present level is Penelope is currently solving 2-digit addition problems with 35% accuracy. So we have a starting point. We have the data. That's bullet number 2. We have 35% accuracy. We have to make sure it circles back to our SMART goal, right? So the goal would be Penelope will be able to solve 2-digit addition problems with 75% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher charted data, and standardized tests by February 2023. So the present levels say where Penelope is starting at right now for this goal. And the goal is stating where we want her to be a year from now. She's starting at 35% accuracy, and we want to move her up to 75% accuracy, solving two-digit addition problems. Now you have to ask yourself, as teams write these goals, is this an aggressive goal or a realistic goal? They can be both, right? It can be an aggressively realistic goal. Sometimes teams like to write very aggressive goals to try and push the student as far as they can. I'm not opposed to that. But as the parent, you need to make the decision, because setting very aggressive goals a year from now means your child might fall short of meeting that goal. So for example, if let's just say it's 2023 now and we're meeting back on Penelope and she was only able to get up to 73% accuracy, technically the team will report to you that Penelope did not meet this goal. You have to ask yourself if you're okay with that. Now, if they set a more realistic goal of, 35% to 75%, that's a pretty big jump. Why don't we back it down to 65%? Well, they may be reporting a year from now that, yes, she met 65%, but she may have been able to meet 73%. But the team didn't push for 75, so we didn't know she could get to 73. It's a personal decision that you have to make as a family on if you're going to be okay a year from now hearing that your child did not meet the goal. Sometimes I'm okay writing very aggressive goals because I want that achievement gap closed as aggressively as possible. Some parents are not okay hearing that a year from now the child did not meet the goal because they don't feel like the team is really doing anything. Well, you consistently don't meet their goals. You have to look at the data that's inside the goal. After the goal is written for the year, the team should be walking you through objectives or benchmarks. And they're essentially mini goals or benchmarks that will lead your child through the remainder of the year to get them to the final destination or the final goal. Some districts are writing objective benchmarks for the entire year, and I'll explain that after we go through our example, but I don't necessarily like it. So we're going to continue with our example of Penelope will be able to solve two-digit addition problems with 75% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher charted data, and standardized tests by February of 2023. Keep in mind the present levels we currently have on Penelope are she's doing all of that at 35%. So the goal is to get her to 75%. So starting at 35%, the objectives or benchmarks that are written are on the right side. The first benchmark we would want her to have is Penelope will be able to solve two-digit addition problems with 45% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher charted data, and standardized tests by May of 2022. So you've essentially taken the entire year from February to February and you've split it into quarters. And at the end of each quarter, the school should be reporting to you on how successful your child is being in terms of meeting this goal. So this example is Penelope should grow from 35%, because remember that's where her present levels are, to 45% by May of 2022. The next short-term objective or benchmark would be Penelope will be able to solve two-digit addition problems with 55% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher charted data, and standardized tests by September of 2022. So it's that second quarter of data, she's grown from 45% to 55%. So you can start to see how the team is expected to measure Penelope's progress for the entire year, but they're splitting it down into smaller chunks so they can report to you on if your child is on track or not to meet that goal. It should not be a surprise at the end of the year when you're meeting for your child's IEP again, whether they met the goal or not. The school should be reporting to you how on track your child is. So returning back to this goal, the final short-term objective or benchmark would be Penelope will be able to solve two-digit addition problems with 65% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher-charted data, and standardized tests by December of 2022. And then the final goal by February would be the entire goal. Penelope will be able to solve two-digit addition problems with 75% accuracy as measured by work samples, teacher-charted data, and standardized tests by February of 2023. So these objectives or benchmarks on the right-hand side of the screen have essentially created a path or stepping stones to get from 35%, which is her present levels, all the way to 75%, which is the end goal. Now, I stated some districts are rewriting these objectives and benchmarks in different ways. What they're starting to do, and I've seen a current trend of this, is some districts are writing objectives and benchmarks for the entire year. So what they're doing is they're taking the skills for solving two-digit addition problems. They're writing short-term objectives, they're not really short-term, they're writing objectives or benchmarks and saying that Penelope needs to meet them by February of 2023. You do not have this stepping stone effect of she's at 35%, she'll be at 45%, she'll be at 55%, she'll be at 65%, and then she'll be at 75%. The problem I have with districts doing that is, as a parent, you don't see how much progress your child is making at each quarter. Then it does become a surprise at the end of the year, the end of the IEP year, when you have your another annual review, if your child meets the goal or not. And if they don't meet the goal, where did it fall apart? And those are questions that, from my experience, have been had at the very end of the year, and emotions run high and people are frustrated. If your district insists on writing objectives and benchmarks for the entire year, the way you can keep track and hold them accountable is when they are giving you progress monitoring updates or progress report updates, which should come every time there's a report card. They need to report out on how successful your child is being. So if in this example we have the goal of 75% accuracy and Penelope is starting at 35% accuracy, and they wrote these short-term objectives and benchmarks for a year from now instead of the way that I wrote them, and a report card and a progress update came home, I would be asking, what percentage is my daughter Penelope currently performing at? Because I want to make sure she's on track to meet this 75%. It should be information the district is already including, but I have noticed some districts are not including it, and they're using terms such as they're doing great, or they're on track to meet this goal. How do you know that? What does that mean? And as the parent, how do you know that? You should see data, you should see percentages that prove that they're on track. And if instead of being at 45% accuracy by the end of the first quarter, they're only at, maybe they're staying at 35%, maybe they're at 37%, they're clearly not making enough progress to meet the 75% accuracy goal by the end of the year. And that is a way to lead that conversation with data to make sure that your child is on track for meeting that goal. We talked a second ago about using data to continue and drive the conversation on benchmarks and short-term objectives and the long-term annual goal. This slide will go into a little more about how to use data, but data drives decisions. The district The teachers, the administrators, everyone at that table should be using your child's individual data to make informed decisions. And it's helpful for you to understand what that means and how to use the data so you can adequately participate in those conversations. What should properly be done is triangulating data points. So you'll look at their grades. You'll look at district assessments such as MAP. You look at the state assessment. It's called the IAR in Illinois. And if your child is in Tier 2, Tier 3 general education interventions, or in special education, they will have progress monitoring data. We'll go into a little more about what progress monitoring data looks like on the next slide. But between grades, district assessment, state assessment, and progress monitoring, the idea is that they all look the same. And all of the data is trending upward to your child's progress and improvement. Now, sometimes we see their grades look really good, and then these big assessments, the data from there doesn't look good. These district assessments doesn't look good, or the state assessment doesn't look good. I've had many conversations like this. First, you need to tease out if the grades are truly a reflection of what your child is doing. I've seen it before where teachers provide so much support that it's difficult to pull out if the teacher knows the material or if the student knows the material. And I know the teachers do it out of a very loving place for their students, but still it's important to know. We need to have the raw student data. So let's just, for this conversation, say the grades are solid. We have good grades and we know that they're objective. They're not getting too much support in the classroom. But then the district assessment or the state assessment, your child really isn't doing that well. I would be looking at a term called generalizing the information across environments. If your child can do really well in class on their grades, tests, homework, quizzes, but then they get to these almost high pressure assessments like district assessments or state assessments, and they are not doing well, you need to start asking yourself why and asking the school team why and what they're seeing. It could be a result of testing anxiety. Maybe some of these tests, these high pressure tests, these high stake tests are causing too much stress and the child doesn't perform well. In that case, it's not because they don't know the material. It's because there's other stressors that are keeping them from answering correctly and kind of blocking their thought process. And that requires a different level of support. It's not necessarily academic support that's needed. It might be more social emotional support, stress coping skills, things like that. So all of this data tells us something. If it's not all going in the same direction of up and progression, then really what does that mean? And that's the part of the conversation where data is driving that. And you can ask those questions as to why do you think this is? What's happening here? I'm seeing anxiety at home. Are you guys seeing it at school? I've had conversations with school districts where they say we're not seeing any stress at school. There's another layer to this. There's so many different layers to all of this. But some of our kids are internalizers, and the school doesn't see it. The schools come back to me and said they're like a model student. They're perfect. But at home and on these assessments, there are meltdowns happening left and right, and the student is barely holding it together. And those are just other conversations, especially if this data is supported by outside therapists that you or your child might be seeing. So it's all important information, and you have to really take a step back and analyze it and then formulate your questions as you move forward. Here's the continuation of that conversation regarding progress monitoring. So progress monitoring takes place in Tier 2 intervention and Tier 3 intervention, which is found in general education. That's if students are starting to fall behind and before they qualify for special education support, they try Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. Special education also does progress monitoring. The main difference is how often progress monitoring is done. I always wanted progress monitoring done as a director of special education once a week. Progress monitoring provides a snapshot of how the child is responding to the intervention that the school district and the teachers are providing. Keep in mind you need 4 to 6 data points to make an informed decision, to really understand if the intervention is working or not. In MTSS Tier 2 and Tier 3, this is typically done every other week. But it's important to understand when progress monitoring is done and how often it's done. Because if it's done every other week, it'll take 8 to 12 weeks to get the data needed to make an informed decision. If it's done every week, it'll take 4 to 6 weeks. If it's done once a month, that means it's going to take 4 to 6 months. That is way too much time to pass to measure if an intervention is working or not. So these are all points to discuss with the school as you're discussing the supports that are being put in place for your child. I want to talk about this graph for a minute. This is what progress monitoring graphs should look like and should be presented to you. If you have an IEP, you should see these at every IEP meeting. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to ask for them. But it is something that they should have on file and they should be presenting to you. Even in Tier 2 or Tier 3, you can ask to see this. So you'll see we've got the score. At the top, there's a little key. We've got the child's score, which is represented by each black dot. We've got an intervention change, which is the arrows going up and down. These are the vertical arrows that you see. That counts. That means that somewhere in, but not somewhere in there, right there, there was an intervention change. We've got the solid black line going up on an angle is the aim line. That's the trajectory we need your child to be on to meet the goal. And the goal line is this green bar on the right side that goes up and down. The star will mean the goal is met. And then if there are double parallel lines, it would mean that there's a goal change in there. But what we need to happen is the student progress line to intersect this black aim line. And you can see here at the very beginning on the left side, the student data is charted and there's a red line going down. The trend is going down. This is showing us that the intervention the school is using is not working. The student is not improving. There is no progress, or the progress is actually declining, right? Then the school district noticed what was going on, changed the intervention, which is marked by this vertical line of arrows, and then the data after that intervention change is moving up. And the trend, which is the green line, the projection line, is following the data. And the data line, the projection line, and the aim line do intersect. And then here we have the goal being met with the star. If the child's data is never going to intersect the aim line, the gap is never going to close. So students that are, let's just say, 3 grade levels behind in math, if they're progressing at the same rate other students are growing, they're going to have parallel lines, and that child is never going to make the adequate progress needed to close the educational gap. What you need these lines to do is intersect. And if they're not intersecting, or the projection isn't for them to intersect, then I would be talking to the school district about another intervention change. Moving on from goals and short-term goals and objectives, we're going to talk about a behavior intervention plan. If your child has an IEP and your child already has a behavior intervention plan, or short for BIP, you may already be familiar with this. But you might not have a behavior intervention plan for your child yet. But it is based on data. It is also based on a behavior that needs to be changed and a behavior over time. I was sitting with a client not too long ago, and their child had left the school building and walked home. They were in middle school, so they knew how to get home, and it was side streets. That was significant cause for alarm. But their behavior intervention plan focused on behavior that was taking place over a long period of time. And I believe theirs was being disrespectful to staff and peers. And you could even argue that their behavior of leaving the building actually stemmed from this, because they became quite frustrated and became disrespectful to staff, and then they kept spiraling until it led to the student trying to escape, which had them leave the building. To have a behavior intervention plan, you first must have a functional behavior assessment. This is where the team goes in, completes an assessment through observations, through rating scales, through interviews with you, with the team. They collect all the data that they think they need to develop a behavior intervention plan. Once that functional behavior assessment is complete, and keep in mind they have 60 days to complete it from when you sign permission. You do need to sign permission for an FBA to be completed. You will have a meeting with the team, and they will go through the different sections of the BIP that outline what the target behavior is. The target behavior means the behavior they're trying to change. What the replacement behavior should be, that's what they're trying to replace the target behavior with, and the steps they're going to go about doing that. And that should actually look like some of those short-term objectives we talked about, right? It should build on each other so that in the end, the target behavior no longer exists, and all that exists is the replacement behavior. But to start this conversation, there needs to be data. So if you are coming to the school and you're saying, look, I'm hearing that I'm getting constant phone calls from teachers saying my son or daughter is doing this, and they're doing this, and they're doing this, and they're doing this, and you approach them and say, I'd like an FBA to be completed, and they say, we don't really have the data that warrants an FBA, I would be saying, then you need to start charting and documenting the phone calls and the behavior that you're calling me about every single time. And if you can produce some of that data, that's very helpful. If you have call logs, or even look at your call history and say, you know, on this day, this day, and this day, I was called, and it's been happening for 3 weeks, and you can say all of that and show them that, that is important data for them to have, and to kind of recognize that there is a pattern, and that this law called child find kicks in, where they are required to evaluate if a child needs more support. A functional behavior assessment and a BIP would be considered more support. So that's how to frame the data for a behavior intervention plan with data, so that you can move forward and have the plan properly documented. And now I've done this next step a few times, and I know school districts do it, and I always called it a baby BIP. If there's behavior that's there that can be taken care of and be modified with simple classroom intervention, such as classroom management skills that all teachers are expected to have and to implement, then I would call that more of a baby BIP. And you wouldn't necessarily need permission for that, nor does the school need to provide a functional behavior assessment for that, because that would fall under the category of general teaching and general classroom management. So if you start to hear terms, and they can call them anything they want, a small BIP, a baby BIP, whatever they might be, you should know that they're talking about an intervention that needs to be done or should be done within classroom management skills. But if that doesn't go away, if that behavior doesn't go away, and they're continually implementing this and there's no progress, then we should be moving on to a functional behavior assessment and a BIP. And with the BIP comes data tracking. The team is documenting very well how the behavior intervention plan is going, so they can see if they need to modify the plan in any way, much like the progress monitoring data we just talked about. There should be a trend where the child is improving And if it's not improving, the behavior intervention plan should be adjusted, and that's done through a formal IEP meeting and IEP process. This next slide, we're going to talk about what questions should you be asking if your child has autism. I think there's an important clarification to make here. A lot of districts will want to see an autism diagnosis from a doctor, but they can give an educational diagnosis of autism based on the needs that they're seeing in the school district. A lot of districts will not do this without some type of formal doctor's diagnosis for autism, and quite frankly, that is the most clear-cut way to keep the paperwork in line and to move forward. But I wanted to bring it up because it is possible to have an educational diagnosis of autism. So moving back to the presentation here, I would be asking yourself, what is the goal for your child? And let that overarching question frame the rest of the questions that you should be asking as your child has autism. Is your goal to have your child obviously pass the current grade, but long-term goals? Are they going to be working? Are they going to be living on their own? Are they going to need support while they're living on their own? And then I would work backwards to make sure that your child is getting the supports and services that they need to learn the skills, the life skills, but also the academics, right? When we ask the question, is your child going to be working? What academics do we need to make sure we have for them that they can be successful in that work environment? At the lower grades, of course, elementary through middle school, we are pushing students as far as we possibly can academically. And hopefully your district is doing the same thing. But I have seen as we get into high schools typically have different strands, and they're either focused more on life skills or more on academics. That doesn't mean that your child has to stay in those strands, and that's where it's important for you to understand your long-term goal for your child. Every child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, and we call it FAPE. And that is a special education law. So if you do not feel like your child is getting a free and appropriate public education, this is something to discuss. And if you don't think they're getting that, make sure you have why you think they're not getting it and what supports and what goals should be put in place so that your child is receiving a free and appropriate public education. From there, you can base your questions to the district on the answers that you've just provided in terms of working after high school or being into a certain strand academically. However that looks, you start asking the district how they're going to meet these goals. And then that conversation will flourish into more questions and more dialogue and more collaboration, where you can start to see how there's a path for these short-term goals to be accomplished so your child can accomplish their long-term goal. A common question and a common conversation I often have revolves around one-to-one support. So I wanted to touch base on when we should be asking for it, how should we be asking for it, and I want to make sure that everyone understands kind of the implications that go along with getting one-to-one support. So as a former director, I always ask the most basic, simplest questions first. I try to frame if a student needs a one-to-one aid around if there is a need for support while they're toileting, or if there is a need for safety, such as eloping. It means that they run, right? They run through the building. I've had children leave the building. Support and safety in terms of what's happening within the classroom. Is there safety concerns for that particular student that has the needs, or are there safety concerns for other students that are in the classroom? All of these questions, if the answer is yes, my radar always went up for one-to-one support. Number one, it needs to be focused on data. We go back to that data conversation. what is happening within the classroom, within the learning environment that would require one-to-one support. But the one thing that I always bring up to families, and I think this is really important, is providing a one-to-one aid can be one of the most restrictive environments that we are putting around a child. And the issue there is I've seen children rely so heavily on if the one-to-one aid is telling them what to do, they stop kind of paying attention to the teacher, and they become so codependent that the tasks as simple as putting your name on your paper, the aid is over their shoulder saying you need to do this, you need to put your name here, and then the child does it, and then the child waits until there's another prompt from the aid to move on the assignment or the classwork or whatever it is that they're doing. So I always want to make sure I have that conversation with the families and even with the school district in terms of what's going on within the learning environment. There's also value in consistency, and there's value in switching when it comes to the person that is a one-to-one support. Especially initially, it's important to have some consistency. While the one-to-one is learning to work with the student, while the student is learning to work with the one-to-one within the parameters that are appropriate and specified for the one-to-one to work with them. There's also value in switching that person over time. We do not want the child to be committed or only listening to one person for that support. It's not that the person is the reason for the support. The child has a need and the support is needed. So we should be able to switch adults in this child's life in and out fairly easily. Now, of course, I understand there's a need for relationships to be built and for trust to be there. So it would be nice if there's obviously some type of introduction period, if a new person is stepping into the role, or if the child is transitioning from one school to the next. There should be some type of rapport building sessions that can be done. But I would be asking what data is being collected that would support a one-to-one. And I always would push students for independence. I want them to be completing these tasks independently. So if it's not revolving around toileting or safety, I want to know how can we have a plan to wean the child away from one-to-one support? Because in the end, and almost all of the families that I talk to, the end goal is to have their child be independent with these skills. And then the next question is, how is this data being communicated to you as the parent? How often is it being communicated to you as the parent? I would want to be seeing data weekly, if not every other week, on the different behaviors that the one-to-one is in there to support. Another question that often comes across my desk is, when should I talk about outplacement in terms of sending my child to a therapeutic day school? There are two sides to this conversation. One of them is typically parents that want an outplacement at a therapeutic day school, but the school district doesn't agree. Or the opposite of that, the school district wants to send the child to an outplacement therapeutic day school, but the parents don't want that. So to kind of run through this slide, it needs to be based on your child's individual need, and it needs to be based on data. The major question to ask when collecting this data is, are your child's needs being met? If the answer is no, if the answer is yes, is the district capable of meeting your child's needs? So in other words, are there other things that the district could be doing that they're not doing yet before they actually send your child to an outplacement therapeutic day school? School districts are required to place children in the least restrictive environment. With that, most districts, and every district is different, most districts have a continuum of services. So there's different layers and different levels of supports that can be implemented for your child. And it goes all the way from general education, obviously, but co-taught special education classrooms where the special ed teacher is essentially pushing into the classroom, to a more restrictive environment, which would be some type of instructional setting where the child is being pulled out and going to a separate classroom to receive instruction. To a more restrictive environment would be a self-contained classroom. So all of these things are on the continuum, and it's easiest to have individual conversations based on what your child specifically needs. But typically when we're talking about an outplacement therapeutic day school, we're looking for a more supportive environment than the school district can provide. And it's not necessarily at the school district's fault, right? The school district has a very specific lane that they operate in, and it's a fairly wide and general lane. And then therapeutic day schools come in for even a more supportive environment. And this day and age, we're looking a lot at mental health and social emotional education. But there's also therapeutic programs that offer that mental health for students that are really far below grade level. Some therapeutic settings offer education at grade level, but also offer that emotional support. So there's a variety of therapeutic day schools out there that have a variety of services that they can support. There's also another one called a diagnostic placement. And this one, it's not as well known of a term, but a diagnostic placement is when you as the parent have agreed to have an evaluation, a special education evaluation done for your child. And if there's data to support that the general education environment is not going to meet your child's needs, you can discuss a diagnostic placement, which means your child goes to the therapeutic day school placement during the evaluation period. So remember that evaluation period is 60 school days. So depending on when this falls, if it's right before winter break or right before Thanksgiving break, you're looking at some extended time in those 60 days. But a diagnostic placement allows the child to essentially be a general education student that will most likely, and the districts won't acknowledge this because it's illegal to predetermine before an evaluation, but everyone kind of knows, will most likely need the support of a therapeutic day school program. So during the evaluation, that child can go to the therapeutic day school setting. If your child already has an IEP and your child's needs are changing, so maybe they didn't need a therapeutic setting during elementary school, but as they progress to middle school or even high school, their body's changing with hormones, the level of demand in terms of school and academics is higher, the level of executive functioning and independence to navigate the school environment is higher. There's all kinds of social pressures that are associated. Everything kind of escalates the further children move in school. So they may not need a therapeutic setting initially, but if the school district is saying we need an evaluation that shows that, and there's going to be a change of placement associated with it, you can still have the diagnostic placement conversation with the school district. Going into special education meetings or meetings in general with the school district can be stressful. And it's a very emotional process because they're talking about your child. So I wanted to talk a minute about how to talk to the administrative team. And the biggest thing you can do is use data. And I know we've mentioned that throughout this entire conversation, and sometimes it can get a little confusing without having the details of your specific child to dive into for examples. But each time I've brought up data, it's to help frame the conversation. The school district and the administrators at the table should be relying on your child's data to make informed decisions. So if you can continue to have conversations that center around the data for your child, you're talking the same language as them. It is a very emotional process. and you are absolutely entitled to be emotional. These are just some helpful hints and tools to help you along your process. Be sure to ask questions. Ask about progress, how your child is doing, progress monitoring. And if they say your child's doing fine or your child's not doing so well, ask them how they know that. You should be seeing those data charts. Even if it's talking about behavior, you should be seeing trends. You should be seeing the data tracking tool that they're using. So make sure you understand how they're tracking the data for your child. And what is the tracking tool? It's important to ask those questions because sometimes team members get confused in the meeting, and by the time you leave, they're not tracking the same behavior or the same information that you think they're tracking. And then a bunch of time is wasted. So be sure you understand how they're tracking the data and how they're taking the information down. And then be sure, is it being measured correctly? Are we talking about a skill? Are we talking about a behavior? What is happening here? And just make sure you have a clear outline and that your understanding aligns with the concerns that you actually have. Now, I do understand that students and children can perform differently at school than they do at home. They can act differently. They're two completely different environments. But make sure that your understanding is the same that the school district has. I always encourage parents to request IEP meetings whenever you want to have an involved conversation with the academic team or with the school district. It is your right to request a meeting at any time. Requesting a meeting has the entire team there, and there can be exceptions. They can talk to you about which team members need to be present. But within requesting a formal meeting, they have to document the conversation in the additional notes. And that memorializes any of the conversation, any of the details that you guys are talking about. It also gives you the ability, once the meeting is over, they should send you a copy of the paperwork you went through, including the additional notes. With that being said, read through those notes a day later, whenever they send it to you, and make sure that the points you wanted to make are adequately documented and their responses are adequately documented. And if they're not adequately documented, you have every right to type up your own notes, email it back to them, always email because then there's a record, and say you want this included in your child's file. They won't include it in the IEP paperwork because technically the IEP paperwork is closed, but they will include it in your child's file, and your child's file will follow them through school. So it will be found in their paperwork as they transition from grade to grade or school to school. And if you really want to make a point and ensure that it's documented, state the words, I want this on the record. That will hint to the district, hey, we need to write this down. After every IEP meeting I've had as an advocate and helping families, I have added my own notes based on what happened in the meeting. Some of the meeting notes are too general, in my opinion. Some of them don't capture the essence of the conversation or the details that I wanted in there. So I type up my own notes, I share it with the family and make sure that I didn't miss anything or they didn't hear anything different, and then I send it back to the school in an email, requesting them to add it to the file, and then for the school district to resend all of the paperwork, including my notes, so that my records and the parents' records match what the school district has on file. As we wrap up this presentation, I want to leave you with a few things to remember. Special education services mean a research-based curriculum and intervention, especially for students that qualify for academics. They're qualifying under reading and or math. The curriculum that they're using, that the teachers are using and the school district is using, needs to be research-based. If it is teacher-created and not research-based, I would be having a very intense conversation about that. The second thing is, keep in mind the burden of proof is on the district. You ask the questions and they have to have the answers, and they're responsible for having the data that supports their answers. So don't be afraid to ask questions. And then the final one is remember your end goal for your child and work backwards to achieve it, and identify which supports you believe are needed for your child to achieve that end goal. Have that conversation openly with the school district. Voice your opinion and listen to what they have to say. Because once they understand your end goal, your ideas might align, or they may have some collaborative, positive ideas to share with you. So it's important to share your information with the district and then work backwards, and that'll get you to your starting point on what your child needs to build upon in terms of life skills and academics to achieve that end goal. You might be asking yourself at this point, what's next? What am I supposed to be doing for my next steps? And just keep in mind that this presentation and this conversation is very broad strokes to cover as many different situations as possible with general but important information. I completely understand that each situation is completely different and it's based on each individual student's needs. So the next steps, if you still have questions, is to either send me an email or give me a call. I am happy to continue the conversation with you about your specific situation. My initial consultation is free, and that is in an effort to remove hurdles from you as the parent getting important information that you need for what you should be doing next to progress through your child's educational process. Here is my contact information if you do have additional questions. Once again, my name is Brandon Cochran. My phone number is 847-754-7917. As I stated before, don't hesitate to call. The initial consultation is free, and like I said, it's to remove hurdles so that you can have important information as you're making very important decisions about your child's education. My email is brandon@feadvocacy.com. The FE stands for Family Educational. And then my website is feadvocacy.com. And if you'd like, you can just hold your camera phone up to this QR code in the camera mode, and my website will pop up, and you just have to click on the little tab. Thank you again for listening, and please reach out if I can help in any way. Take care.